Welcome to Little Feet Community Podcast, where the wonders of childhood take center stage. I'm Patty O'Connor, a retired preschool director and your host. In each episode, we will chat with professionals, parents, and community members to get to the heart of what it really takes to help those early years feel magical for both you and your child. Our guest today is cognitive psychotherapist, media commentator, author, and podcast host, Nero Feliciano. Nero's podcast, All Things Life, invites you into conversations with authors, speakers, mental health and wellness specialists, and other experts to help you live your fullest life. Nero is the author of This Book Won't Make You Happy, a humor-filled guide to help you find your true contentment. Nero has a new book due out in October of 2025 called All is Calmish, How to Feel Less Frantic and More Festive During the Holidays. That's perfect timing for release. So let's imagine that you arrive at the park to pick up your child. They've been there enjoying a play date with a friend, and as you walk over to the playground, you hear your child bossing their friend around. Is that my kid bossing their friend? Where did that come from? And is it here to stay? To help us better understand personality development, I'd like to welcome Nero Feliciano. Welcome, Nero.
Thank you so much, Patty. And as you were doing the intro, I was thinking, oh my gosh, I wish I had your podcast when my kids were small, because I don't remember childhood always being very magical. I could have used your advice back then.
Well, I have to say that's one of the great benefits to technology is how much is at your fingertips now. So thank
That's
you.
right.
Yeah. So Nero, in our emails leading up to today's episode, you kindly shared a Medicine Net article on the topic of personalities. And the first line of the article, it was, everyone is born with a distinct personality type. And this one line really altered my mindset about personality. The idea that its framework is present at birth, that's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So would you mind, maybe I thought one of the best ways to start would be to just ask you to define personality for us.
Sure. And I believe personality are certain traits that are innate to the spirit of a person. I'll take a spiritual perspective from it. However, as you and I talked about, it is very moldable and dynamic and will change depending on what influences are around, we'll say, the child and that personality and how it develops. So if we look at Erickson's stages of development, which we discussed, we see that personality changes throughout the lifespan of a child. However, I do think that there is some truth to kids coming out with certain traits that are strong from the get-go. And I think for those of us who now have teenagers or adult children, we can say, oh, we saw that characteristic from the time they were 2 months old, right? There may be different influences to shaping and solidifying that characteristic, such as birth order, depending on the influences around the child at that time and what stayed consistent throughout their life. But I do think, especially having 4 children and having them all be very different, I do think there's some characteristics that I saw from the get-go that I'm seeing now as an 18-year-old or as a 16-year-old. So
Yeah.
I do think there's some truth in that.
Yeah. Nero, what about the aspect of our physiological beings? How does that play into it? Because I think, for example, of a child who is highly sensitive to noise or touch, and how that can make them seem introverted. But I mean, who knows if they were introverted at birth? I don't know. I'm so fascinated by this.
It's really interesting because, so I'll go back to something that I said actually very recently on the Today Show, the last time I was there, is that when you look at personality traits, there's so many facets of a personality trait, some that are going to prove to be challenges in that child's life. And the same trait is going to also be a strength. So the way I described it was, think about two sides of the same coin. So that example you just gave me of the child who is highly sensitive, maybe it manifests physically when they're younger. I have one child, and she's my oldest child, who I know a certain batch of clothing were hers at 3 years old because there are no tags and no feet on the pajamas. We had to cut everything off. And I know that those were hers because she was the only one who had that.
Mm.
So she had that sensitivity. But now looking at her as an 18-year-old, she's incredibly sensitive to the emotional needs of people around her. She can detect that. So I think that sensitivity may be that personality trait. It just manifests in different ways. It came out physically when she was younger, but now I can see it as an asset, even in terms of her leadership. Emotionally, she has that same sensitivity. So it's an interesting phenomenon to see how, a young, these things may come out physically, but it is one facet of that trait that we can then see through various components of that child's personality later on.
It's absolutely fascinating. And how would you like if you take that similar approach to the idea of a child who's maybe like I know in the article it talked about under controlled, but in the
Yes,
classroom, we might talk about a lack of self-regulation.
sure.
Like how would that same thing work with personality?
Yeah, and that is a complicated category. I will say that because there are also different external factors that can affect a child to not assist them in developing self-regulation, right? So if we give in to everything for a child, if they just have to scream and shout and they get what they want, we are seeing more and more that screens play a part in that lack of self-regulation because of the overstimulation and the heightened levels of dopamine that kids get with extended time on screens. But I'll give you an example with my fourth child. And it's interesting because first I talked about my first child, which I obviously parented differently. I'm just going to add this into our conversation right now because oftentimes I meet with parents and I hear them say, these kids are so different, but I parented them all the same. And we don't. We're a very different parent in terms of our knowledge and experience and our time with our first child than we are with subsequent children after. So maybe there's some similarities, but just by virtue of evolution as a parent and even as an adult, we're going to parent differently depending on the kids and depending on their needs and what they require. So my fourth child was the child that you just described, very energetic, very outspoken, and certainly unregulated. And I remember at one point watching her grow. She's now 11 years old. What we noticed was she was also the most natural gifted athlete out of the four. She was uninhibited, she was aggressive. And when we were trying to manage some of those behaviors at home, I said to my husband, we don't want to suck all this out of her. This is the exact thing that makes her a force on the soccer field or on a basketball court. Again, it's that two sides of that coin. So, through different parenting techniques, different situations, and obviously developmentally, as their awareness changes and they grow, some of those things will resolve naturally. But some of those things, certainly, we have to be more intentional about encouraging, in the case of that child, learning delayed gratification, right? And whereas we may not have to teach it to another child where it comes naturally, some childs who out of the get-go are more uninhibited and unregulated, we may have to be more intentional about teaching them that.
Yeah, yeah. And that also makes me think of the scenario at the top of the episode where, and you can speak to that, but like this idea of being bossy, of course, you don't want to squash that. There's a lot to be learned. So would you mind speaking to that, Nero?
Yeah, yeah. And I think for many of us for some reason, whose youngest children are girls, we experience this. And what's interesting is my fourth child, a lot of her very good friends are the youngest girls in the family, and they are all like
Interesting.
spitfires. So I think they're the only ones that can manage each other. So what's interesting about that, what we always say is, those girls are going to run the world one day. We
Mm.
just have to get through the challenges of parenting them sometimes. And just keeping that bigger picture perspective. We want these kids, whether they're whatever gender they are, we want to encourage them to be able to use their voice and speak up and
Mm.
encourage the fact that they're going to be great leaders one day. So keeping that bigger picture perspective helps to give us a little bit more grace for those moments in parenting, but at the same time, we're going to teach them there's certain situations where, yes, you want to use your voice. So in the classroom, yes, raise your hand. And when you're called on, then say whatever you want to say. We don't want to interrupt the teacher the entire time when they're telling a story, right? We don't want to interrupt our friends when we're talking. And sometimes that may require a more concrete intervention. Whereas, you can give a child, even in the home, speaking with siblings,
Mm.
here, whoever has this toy or pencil or scarf gets a turn to talk, and you don't talk until you get that. So, there's certain characteristics that we're going to be more intentional about encouraging with kids like that versus kids who are quiet, who we want to encourage them to speak up.
Right. And in other areas, like with emotional intelligence, we talk a lot about the toolbox that you help your child build. So it's
Yes.
just recognizing and validating their traits and the challenges that might come with those traits. It's very important.
That is so important because there's some traits that annoy us more than others in parenting, right? And
Sure.
right, and something to think about too, which I learned later in life, is our perception of what a quote unquote good kid is. What is a good kid? Right? And a lot of times when we're in that exhausting stage of parenting, we're like the kid who listens and the kid who does what we want them to do, right? The kid who is quiet and is not always bothering us and who gives us a minute to rest. But think about how those qualities play out later on when that kid is in a situation that is difficult, right? When there's let's say an aggressive child or a bully, is that kid going to be the kid who has the emotional resilience and the strength to be able to stand up to that person, or are they going to do what they're told? So it's important that we encourage the moments where those kids show those qualities. So even for the kid who doesn't give you a moment to rest, we want to encourage that, you know what? You have so much energy, and that is so great. That's so great. And here, we're going to get this ball and kick it around outside for a while. And there's going to be time for that. And then time when we come home and you're going to play in your room, with whatever you want to play. What do you want to play? Let's get you set up for that, right? Versus, and parents are human. We all make mistakes.
Of course.
I've made them repeatedly for years. I
Me
continue to with
too.
teenagers. We learn as we go.
Hmm.
But it's important to think through some of those situations, especially if something happens repeatedly and our feedback is consistently negative towards a certain child.
And now we are going to pause for a message from our sponsor. This episode was brought to you in part by the letter L for Le Petit Bistro. Since 1986, Le Petit Bistro, a cherished institution in Rhinebeck, has honored the French countryside tradition of local foraging, farming, and butchering. It offers a specials board that changes daily and a serpentine lilac marble oyster bar featuring a full menu of cocktails, mocktails, wine, and beer, drawing locals back regularly to celebrate with friends and family. Reservations are highly recommended. For more information, please visit www.lepetitbistro.com. That's www.lepetitbistro.com. And we are back to Little Feet Community with our guest, Nero Feliciano. But now, Nero, I know that through your extensive work as a clinical psychotherapist, you've begun to develop some theories about how birth order, right? How birth
Yes,
order impacts personality. I would
yes.
love for you to share that
Mhm.
with us.
I think birth order is incredibly powerful for two reasons. One, again, like I said, we parent differently depending on which child it is. Certainly personality, but definitely birth order. I
Mm.
mean, that first child is an experiment,
Yeah.
and the learning curve is so steep. And what we notice with kids who are the first, and especially if they're girls too, they tend to be more autonomous, they tend to be more independent, they tend to be leaders. I remember being in a graduate class at Columbia, and our professor said, "How many of you are first or only children?" I'm not joking, it was over 90% of the room
That's
that were first or
fascinating.
only children. It was
Yeah.
really fascinating.
Huh. Mm.
Whereas the middle child tends to be the diplomat, they're the peacemaker. A lot of times, because they're sandwiched in the middle, they internalize a lot of the conflict around them and try to mediate it. We've seen that pretty typically with middle children. They can be more sensitive for that reason because they're trying to create a balance between, the oldest, the youngest, other children in the family. So they tend to be the negotiators and the peacemakers
Huh.
in the family. And youngest, a lot of times things are done for them. We
Mm.
treat them like the baby, and there's a parenting piece of that too because we're looking at the older kids and what they're capable of doing. But they also tend to be, I think, the most uninhibited in a lot of families. And I'm generalizing completely. There's certainly other
Of course.
situations that fit this. And again, nurture and the environment they're growing up in and their influences strongly influence these descriptions that I'm giving you.
Mm.
But one of the things I've heard from coaches, because all my kids have played sports, is oftentimes the most natural athlete is the youngest
Mm.
because they tend to come out fighting. They're fighting for their rights, they're fighting to be heard, they're fighting for the same privileges as their older siblings have.
Mm-hmm.
So birth order is really interesting
Mm.
in development of personality. And on the flip side of that, depending on what your birth order is, will impact the way you parent these children as well,
Oh.
which is
Huh.
interesting because I
Yes.
I am I am the oldest child, and the other thing we see with oldest children is a lot of times we internalize a lot of our parental expectations
Mm.
in a way that youngest children are more free from it. We tend to be more of the rule followers. And that is very evident in the way that I've parented, especially my oldest child, compared to my youngest sister, and how she's parented her only child. Much more free and magical, like the way you described. So
No, it's all
I
magical, girl.
it's all magical, right? It's all
Yeah.
magical. So I attribute some of that to our own birth order and how that influences the way that we parent as well.
Now, it makes me also think of only children.
Mm-hmm.
You know, should we assume, therefore, that an only child is more similar to the eldest child in terms of their personality?
Generally, that's what we tend to see, that they are a little bit more similar to the oldest child and again, it depends on the influences around them. Sometimes only children can resemble youngest children too, because they are the baby forever,
Yeah, that's
and we
true.
can tend to do more for them, and not encourage the same sort of independence with only children. But I think
Mm,
only children have the potential to look many different ways depending
mm,
on the influences around them. But generally, there are similarities between eldest children and only children.
mm. Very interesting. Now, Nero, if you don't mind, I'd love to offer some advice for parents on how to react when we see personality aspects arise that, that we don't necessarily think will serve our child well. Um,
Sure.
we talked about how, a bossy personality can become, a lovely, assertive personality later in
Yes.
life. But what
Hmm.
advice can we give to the parent about how to react at that moment so as not to kind of stomp on it?
Yeah. Take deep breaths. We need to regulate our own nervous system, because,
Yeah.
and there are so many layers to this conversation, Patty, and some of which it took me. Now I've been a parent for almost 19 years. It took me years to figure this out. And one question I would ask a parent to consider is, what is it about that child and that behavior that triggers you? Because we are going to be triggered by different things depending on the child. And oftentimes, if we're going to zoom out and take a bigger picture, psychological perspective on this, And especially having worked with family therapists before, they say our child often reveals what is unhealed in ourselves as humans. That is what gets triggered. You will find often that you are triggered by the child who has traits most like you, and oftentimes traits that you don't necessarily like about yourself. We see this often women who struggle with body image. They're often triggered if they have a child who is heavier or who doesn't look a certain way, because that's a piece of us that's unhealed in ourselves. Now, some of it is when you're parenting young kids, like we're exhausted. Um, and it gets more exhausting as they get older, especially emotionally in terms of the driving commitment, all the places that you have to take them and the things that they are expected to do. So it's important that you take care of yourself. You when you can, and there's certain exhausting stages that are just a season. But that when you address behavior like that, you don't address it reactively. We want to address it beneficially and productively. So we have to be in a good mental space to do that. But I would say this is one of the most important questions in terms of your own evolution as a parent, your own growth as an adult, is to sit with that idea. What is it about that trait that affects me so deeply? Because then we get to the underlying work of, all right, I actually have to heal some things in me before I can be the parent that this child deserves.
Now, Nero, the idea of speaking about children in front of children, that's something that often came up, as teachers we would say, well, let's talk about that another time rather than speak about it in front of the child. And that made me think about this idea of not necessarily using labels in when you're speaking about a child in front of them. I once had a 4-year-old say to me, "Well, I'm shy." And that was their
Mm.
reason for not really wanting to put themselves out there socially. So, can you speak to that for our listeners?
Yeah, I think it's important, and it's so easy to do to label kids. And there's some positives in labeling them in the affirmative, right? In saying that you're a great leader. However, especially when we're looking at families, we want to affirm that each child has the potential to be a great leader. And there are going to be situations where many children feel shy, and that's normal if an environment is uncomfortable. So instead of labeling the child, I would label the situation or the behavior. There's certain situations that might make you feel shy, right? And there are certain situations where you're really comfortable and you're not shy. But labeling them as shy, and by the way, I've done that with my kids at
Oh, I'm
different
sure
times
I have
too,
as
right?
well.
Yeah,
Absolutely,
we've
yeah.
we've done it in different ways. I think it's just now to be mindful of it once we're aware that it can have some negative effects on the child, to begin to change the way that we talk about characteristics around them. I think that's important. Shy or bossy, or I'm trying to think of other sensitive, those kind of labels. We have to be careful with kids because they can carry that into adulthood. Absolutely. Because one of the things we know about identity, it's not necessarily based on what we think about ourselves. It's not based on what other people think about us. It's based on what we think other people think about us, how other people perceive us. So labels play into that. And especially as children are young and developing their identity, it's important to use a range of descriptive words to describe them depending on the situation.
Yeah, thank you for that. That makes me also think about the importance of, we talked earlier about kind of scaffolding your child's learning and helping them feel prepared for experiences that will help them work through some of those feelings that they're having and the
Yes.
value in that. So, thank you.
Absolutely. Supporting them through that and encouraging traits that don't come naturally to that
Mm,
child as much as possible, giving them opportunities to develop some of those traits. So for the child who is more quiet and who tends to be more shy, encouraging more social interaction for
mm,
that child, doing things that they enjoy doing things that they feel like they're good at. Those things are going to encourage other traits to help them see that they're capable of a spectrum of feelings.
yeah. And then, Neuro, the last question I was really thinking about was this idea that personalities, the foundation of a personality is really set by the age of 5. I often
Mm,
have at parent teacher conferences, parents ask me about that. My child is 4. What do I do? They would look at it as the door closes after 5. And I know
mm,
we talked a lot about nature nurture, how experiences continue to help you develop.
yes, for
Um,
sure.
what would you say to parents who are kind of looking at that 5-year-old timeline?
Yeah, I don't find that that holds up. No,
I love
not
that.
in
Let's
real
just.
life. Yeah, it doesn't. And I mean, I can think of so many situations clinically that I've seen and in parenting where we look at a child at 5 years old and part of it is triggered by our own anxiety. Oh my gosh, is
Yeah.
this child ever going to make friends? They're so shy.
Mm,
But even thinking through some of my own children, and this is anecdotal, but I have seen this hold up in the research as well, that my 5-year-old oldest child was very shy and timid. And we did give her that extra year of kindergarten. And now, I mean, she is such an outspoken leader. Not anything that I thought I could have imagined for her at 5 years old. But it just shows if we continue to support our child's development, encourage them, give them the proper boundaries, and especially the affirmation that they need in the right situations. And when I say affirmation, a lot of times we tend as parents to affirm accomplishment or outcome, but we want to affirm attributes more so than accomplishment because this plays into the whole culture of success that now these kids are suffering from anxiety because of. So instead of only affirming when they get a good grade or they perform well in a show or on a soccer field, we want to affirm effort. You worked really hard. You did a great job, whether or not they won the game or not. We want to affirm kindness. We want to affirm compassion. We want to affirm courage, those qualities versus simply outcome, positive outcome. Then we will begin to see a child open up and flourish and really be able to fulfill their full potential, whatever that might look like in the end.
yeah, and Navro, I didn't mention it in the introduction, but a lot of your work does focus on stress,
Mm,
correct?
yeah.
Yeah.
Stress, anxiety, and really what it's leading to are increased rates of anxiety, depression, and substance, both in adults, but especially alarmingly in young people now. And I do think screens are a big part of it, but it really is so multifactorial. It's the busyness of children. I mean, children are overscheduled from the time that they're in preschool. Sometimes, and this, you have to be careful about this for only children as well, because you have more time than if you had multiple children, and these children tend to be kind of put into everything, which is great. But we have to look at what is the cost of that emotionally. Do children have downtime? Do they have unstructured play? Do they actually have time to connect with you? Or are you so exhausted running around trying to make sure they're successful in all these areas and try everything that you don't have the energy to connect with them at the end of the day? We are sacrificing things that are so important for their development to be able to check boxes. So that starts really young. And honestly, I wish I knew now, having been in practice for 20 years and now having kids who are entering adulthood, I wish I knew that at the preschool age. I certainly would have done things differently.
Mm. Yeah, it's a reminder to take a holistic approach.
Yes. Yes.
And I also think about all that running around. You pull into McDonald's, you know, even in
Yes.
terms of how your children are learning to eat, how they're learning to
Yes.
care for themselves, it's also vital.
So important. And also, you're modeling that behavior. Are
Mm,
you modeling joy for them? Or are you
right.
so depleted? Are you modeling healthy habits in terms of self-care and exercise and nutrition?
Mm,
What we say, right, is kids, what they learn is more caught than taught. So they're
I love that.
absorbing it, right,
Right,
from their environment.
right.
So they're watching, and they can see through the things that are disingenuous pretty quickly, as you know. I know you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
So those things are important to think of through too when we're thinking about what is the type of environment that is going to nurture their personality and develop their potential.
Naro, thank you so much for this conversation. I know your guidance today will help benefit parents and children, so I greatly appreciate it. You've helped me think about things in a different way. So I really appreciate that gift that you've given to me today. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Patty. It's really an honor and a pleasure to sit with you and talk to you. And just getting to know you a little bit here and there in your personality. And you have such a calm and encouraging demeanor. Whoever was in your preschool class, I'm sure they're phenomenal kids and adults now, having you a big part of their formative years.
Oh, thank you very much. That's tremendously kind of you. This has been the Little Feet Community Podcast. I'm Patty O'Connor, a retired preschool teacher and your host. A special thanks to our producer, Miranda Schaefer, and associate producer, Tara Schaefer. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and rate us on your podcast platform of choice. And please check out our Instagram account for news of future episode topics and opportunities to submit questions to our guests. You can submit your question through our Instagram account at Little Feet Community. You can also learn more about Little Feet Community on our website, www.littlefeetcommunity.com, and at our YouTube channel, www.youtube.com/@Little Feet Community. Thanks for joining us, and don't forget to play.